All right, welcome back to Module 2. In our first lesson, we're going to be talking about the trimester roadmap. So we're going to get an idea of what you can expect across your pregnancy. So big picture, what that hormonal timeline looks like, why your insulin needs change, and why it's predictable. And this is what gives you your advantage, knowing what's coming. First trimester, generally considered to be weeks 1 to 12. You might also see that as weeks 1 to 14. This is going to be your insulin sensitivity phase where you are more sensitive than you might expect to be, hence an HCG surprise. So around week 6, so the time where you've taken a positive pregnancy test, you've missed your period, HCG is the hormone that is detected on that pregnancy test. HCG is rising, and as it does, it creates greater insulin sensitivity. So you'll probably see about a 10 to 20% reduction in the amount of insulin that you need. Around week 7 to 12, progesterone begins to rise or continues to rise, and HCG is peaking. So there's a little bit more of unpredictability that you might see, because alongside of that, you're also managing morning sickness. And again, you're going to see about a reduction of about 10 to 20%. So you're watching for lows, especially overnight and fasting. Something that I think has been really interesting is when I first started learning about managing my blood sugars around my period, this was how I actually knew that I was pregnant before I had a positive pregnancy test. So our hormones outside of pregnancy are equally important for determining, or giving us a guideline for what we can expect in changes throughout the month for our blood sugars and our levels of sensitivity. So progesterone tends to create insulin resistance. And at the end of your period, so say that's day 28 for you, if you're right there at a 28-day cycle, about day 27, 26 maybe, generally it's like 36 hours before you get your period, you'd see a dip in progesterone and therefore a dip in your blood sugars. I think it's pretty common to experience having a low blood sugar right before your period comes. And then during your period, when your progesterone is very low, you're more insulin sensitive. You have, a lower fasting glucose generally, so on and so forth. So for me, what I noticed is that instead of getting a pre-period low, I had a sustained higher blood sugar. So in the later luteal phase of our periods, when progesterone is high, our blood sugars are higher. We're more insulin resistant. And I remember noticing like, gosh, I need more insulin than I've ever needed. And my understanding is that because pregnancy is a stressed state, that the cortisol level, or our general cortisol levels, are impacted by the progesterone that doesn't drop. We're not having a dip in progesterone, and we're seeing HCG. So there's kind of some additional stress on our body, which creates a surge or a greater need around weeks 3.5 to 5 weeks, as we're preparing for that positive pregnancy test, that we wouldn't see if we weren't pregnant. So it's more predictable, though, to look at week 6 and say, this is when you're going to potentially begin to see lower blood sugars and adjusting your insulin levels appropriately. Second trimester, again, weeks 12 to 14-ish through week 26. We're looking at acceleration of what's called human placental lactogen. So this is made by the placenta. HPL is made by the placenta. And HPL is going to be sort of the dominant hormone later as we get to the middle and later parts of second trimester. So in weeks 12 to 14, it's going to be sort of a stability sweet spot where you aren't seeing as many lows as you saw early in the first trimester, and you've not yet had an increase in the placental hormones. In weeks 14 to 17, you're going to begin to see that resistance accelerate, and you're going to be able to anticipate increasing your basal and your bolus rates accordingly, or your long-acting insulin if you're doing MDIs. From weeks 20 to 26, you're really going to see that resistance kick in. And there is a 5% rule that also kicks in. So studies have shown that on average, your insulin requirements will increase by about 5% from around week 20. And this is true through near the end of third trimester. Um, You'll also see an intensification potentially of dawn phenomenon. So if you are someone who sees and experiences the dawn phenomenon outside of pregnancy, it is very likely that this will simply intensify through pregnancy. I personally do experience this. And therefore I have, in my mind, again, this is one of those personal patterns that you've noticed outside of pregnancy that you can take into pregnancy and know, okay, I'm probably going to have to be more aggressive with the adjustments that I'm making around 4 a.m. or around 6 a.m. You'll also see post-meal patterns change. So our digestion is intensely affected. We've all probably heard about, morning sickness, of course, but then also, maybe heartburn or feeling like you have to eat smaller meals because as baby gets bigger, there's less room, and our internal digestion is affected in such a way that insulin being absorbed is delayed. And that can affect how we bolus. And we'll talk about that. Okay. Third trimester, weeks 27 to 40. This is the peak resistance period. So human placental lactogen and cortisol are peaking, which means that your maximum insulin resistance phase has been entered. You've arrived. Weeks 33 to 36, you'll continue to see those higher needs, but the overall rate of increase is likely to slow. And then weeks 37 to 40, you'll probably see an actual plateau of the increasing and even a slight decrease. Overall, there's going to be a 100 to 200% increase from your pre-pregnancy levels. So some women actually end up needing 3 times their pre-pregnancy doses. And this is really normal. Again, coming back to your hormones are changing drastically, and that is supporting your baby's health and well-being. It's facilitating their growth. So you can expect to see this, and it's happening within a non-diabetic woman as well. It's just that she's not monitoring it. She's not having to do the mental work to ensure that her pancreas is delivering the insulin, so on and so forth. Things that we would be watching for would be dramatic basal rate needs. So what I mean by that is, are we looking at shifts, huge shifts that are happening at this point? And you wouldn't expect, because the cortisol peak has happened, because the HPL peak has already happened. By the time we're at around week 32, we're likely not going to see the dramatic shifts that we saw in the middle to late second trimester and early third trimester. So if you all of a sudden saw a huge decrease in your insulin, like you had, 2 days in a row where you were super low, and, you were kind of crashing after every meal, and between meals, you were having to eat snacks, and you hadn't gotten a bunch of exercise, that would be a red flag. You'd say, okay, what's going on hormonally that is affecting that? What's happening potentially with my placenta or with my baby? And it could be a good clue for you to be in touch with your endocrinologist or in touch with your OB. Meal timing requirements, again, from a digestion perspective, not only are we timing when we administer our insulin in order to maximize the insulin's effectiveness, but we're also considering how long is it going to take for that glucose to be absorbed in our system. So this hormonal timeline creates a predictable pattern. So there's a visual curve that we can see with HCG, progesterone, HPL, and cortisol by week. And it corresponds to the changes that we see in our insulin requirements. So again, you're going to see individual variation that happens in terms of, maybe you have been a lifelong athlete. And so your overall average requirements are lower than they might otherwise be for someone your height and weight. But otherwise, what else might you see that would impact that? Diet. We'll talk more about this in a subsequent module, but how do you typically behave? Are you someone who eats pretty low carb, generally speaking? You might not see as much of a need to shift that during pregnancy. If you're someone who normally would be on a higher carb trend, I'm not calling either good or bad. I know that different perspectives exist on that, but if outside of pregnancy, you are someone who eats a lot of fruit and a lot of whole grains, you might see that that gets a bit more complex to manage. But it also might be simply genetics, right? Like we can't control every aspect of what impacts our insulin requirements. So we can use this hormonal or this hormone knowledge to anticipate rather than react. And when we are ahead of the ball, we're able to make those adjustments with less anxiety and less concern. So, the key takeaway for this lesson is that your body is following a predictable hormonal pattern. It's actually something that has brought me a lot of um, confidence and assurance during pregnancy, is that my baby and my body are doing what they need to. So, first trimester brings an increased sensitivity, needing 10 to 20% less insulin. Second trimester, we begin to see that resistance with about 5% weekly increases from around week 20. And during the third trimester, we're going to see our max, a peak of our maximum resistance. And we might see up to 3 times, 100 to 200% increase from our preconception rates.